This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today I'm going to be doing kind of a special request video concerning the issue of, I guess you could say, the Sefer Yoel, which is in the Tanakh, reading it in Hebrew versus reading or using a King James Version Bible. So this is kind of a little bit out of my wheelhouse a little bit, but not very much. So we'll get into that issue in just a second. So what's the purpose of this video? Well, what happened recently is I had someone who was an Hebrew Israelite questioning me about the validity of a King James Version Bible, as well as the validity of an English language text. And one of the things I was trying to explain to him is that the text used by Hebrew Israelites is not the same as a text that's in Hebrew. It just isn't the same. You can't see the same things. And the interaction between the texts is not the same. So one of the things I wanted to do was to show them that when reading the Hebrew text, there's no reason for someone who reads Hebrew to even consider English translation of any type to be valid for the most part. Because again, as I've shown in other videos, a translation is just an attempt that someone's making, and there are people who bring their own little prejudices into the translation. So if someone has a prejudice or bias towards one way, they bring that into the translation, where a person who has the original text can just read it as it is and get it from the source itself, for example. So again, the video is going to basically show to this person, for example, why a Jew who holds by Torath Mosheh would never ever go to like a King James Version Bible or translation, but of course definitely not a King James Version of the Bible. Okay, so first of all, just noting the differences, I mean, if someone were to give you a choice and say, okay, you have a choice between me teaching you this language up front, teaching the Hebrew language, and you reading from an ancient text, versus you taking this like English King James Version of the Bible over here, what would you choose? Well, obviously, someone who wants to know like what the actual text says and wants to know the truth of the text would not go with the translation, no matter who does the translation, and especially not a King James Version of it. I mean, that's essentially a Christian text. As Jews, we don't use Christian text in that way. So a Jew, for the most part, who holds by Torath Mosheh would never go to a translation. They would pick up the Hebrew text and read it for themselves. And they would definitely not go to a King James Version Bible, for example, because that's not authoritative, amongst Jews especially. So let's go back through, and I went through this in a previous video, and the basic issue is this: Jews who hold by Torath Mosheh have the ability to go to the source material. So essentially, Torath Mosheh Jews are taught at a young age how to read, write, and understand ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. Second of all, Torath Mosheh Jews understand ancient texts by reading them from start to finish. Again, I'll repeat that. We read text from start to finish. This is going to become important when we're going through this particular person's question, for example. And also, Torath Mosheh Jews don't rely on English translations as sources. So, for example, if someone were to ask me what a particular Hebrew text says, or a 3,000-year-old text says, or even a 2,000-year-old text, I wouldn't run and go to my local library or to a store and buy a translation. I'd just pick up the Hebrew text and read it for myself, as I'll show you in just a second. Okay, so let's get right into it and start. First of all, I'm going to be using the Aleppo Codex when it comes to this person's question and responding to it. And I'm going to be starting at the very beginning of the Sefer Yoel, which is called Sefer Yoel. In English, I think they call it Joel. But in Sefer Yoel, I'm going to start at the very beginning, because the only way to really know what's being talked about is to start at the very beginning. And then from there, you work your way through it. And that's how Jews who hold by Torath Mosheh, that's how we do things. Okay, so just to prepare you for how I'm going to try to do this, I have had to go through this several times to try to figure out the best way to do this. And again, what I want to show you is that a Jew who holds by Torath Mosheh starts at the very beginning of a text. We don't start in the middle somewhere to try to figure out what's being talked about or what the situation is. You have to start at the very beginning, because at the beginning, it gives you the idea of what it is that you're about to read. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to first read the beginning of this in Hebrew. And then while I'm moving through the text to get to the area of this person's question, for example, essentially what I'm going to do is explain to you what was read and kind of what the idea is that we should be looking for as we go further into the text. So let's begin right now. Devar Adonai asher hoya el Yoel ben Pothuel shima'u zot hazakenim v'hazinu כל יושבי הארץ, היודו זאת בימיכם, ואם בימי אבותיכם. עלהו לבניכם saperu uvenechem levenehen uvenehen ledor acher. So as we move through, essentially what that just told us is that this book is going to be jumping between the past and the present, the past and the future. Because it mentioned for one point that it was going to be dealing with things that happened in the past to the Avot, for example, the forefathers of Am Yisrael in this situation. But it also mentions it's going to be talking about their children in another time frame, so it's like Dor Acher. So what that basically tells us that we're going to be dealing with the past and also dealing with the future. That this Navi is bringing up events that do affect the present, like I was mentioning earlier, but also is going to be dealing with the past and the future. So it's going to have some jumps where we're going to see that information come to play, and we're going to be looking for wording that allows us to know when the future is being represented and when something in the past is being represented. And that's something that really only person who reads the Hebrew would know up front and would have no reason to look through an English translation to try to figure out. So going further to this questioner's part where they go through chapter 4, starting at chapter 4, it says, Ki hine bayamim hohemo uve'et hahi asher oshiv et shuvut Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. Now we're going to the part where Yerushalayim shows up, which is on the next part of the page. Okay, then we have V'kibatzti et kol hajoyim v'horadtim al emek Yehoshaphat v'nishpatati imam sham al ami v'nachalothi Yisrael asher pizvru v'joyim et artzi chilegu. Sorry. So essentially, we've just read through, and what we read through in that section in particular, what it basically says is it talks about a time when the nations are going to be gathered together in a place called Emek Yehoshaphat. And in that place, it basically says Nishmatati Imam. So essentially, it deals with the fact that the inhabitants of Yehuda and Yerushalayim will be judged, with them, and the judge, of course, being the creator of all things. And it says in that place, Shom al amei v'nachalothi Yisrael asher pizvru v'joyim at artzi haliku. So essentially what it's talking about is this is going to be a judgment between the people of Israel and also the nations that essentially spread Israel through the nations. So essentially the armies, like in one of the commentaries, for example, talks about Titus being the person that, for example, like made this happen, that this is being talked about, because later on it goes into a particular nation from Yavan. Or like Greece that basically did this. And essentially it's just saying that the people of Israel will be judged between them and the nations of the world that spread the Jews around. And it talks about this happening at a certain particular time, which we'll get into in just a second. Okay, so now picking up in this bit by bit, let's go to chapter 3. Again, we've treated this as we've gone through chapter 1 all the way through. And once we get to chapter 3, we start to see a little bit of a shift that points towards what this person's question is. So again, dealing with the fact that chapter 3 tells us what we're going to be reading going further into chapter 4, we find the following. And this is going to be marked in red. وَهُيَوْ أَخَرِخِيَنْ أَشْبُخْ et ruchi al kol basar v'niba'u benechem uvanotechem ziknechem chalamot chalamon bachur rechem chazionot yir'u. So again, what this is talking about is that it says after a certain point, Hashem will pour out His ruach, for example, al kol basar. Now, what's important here is when He's talking about kol basar, v'niba'u benechem uvanotechem uzikanechem chalumot yachalamun bechurechem chazionot yir'u. What it's talking about is in the land of Israel, there's going to be a situation where there's going to be a certain uplifting of the ruach of Hashem. So kind of going into like trying to define this for people who don't really read the Hebrew, what we would want to do is also like continue a little bit further, and then we'll break down each part of this and see what it's saying. And in the next part, what it says, "V'gam al ha'ovadim al ha'shbachot v'yamim ho'hemo ashbuch et ruchi." So then let's deal with what all this means. Okay, going by the first part we mentioned, which is in the red, we can see that it's talking about future events, and we'll get into exactly why that is in just a second. And this is something that was mentioned in the first part of the book when we read it. Now going to the blue part, we also see some things about future events. Now translated, what we want to get into is that this again is going into how the spirit of the ruach of Hashem is going to be poured out upon the people in the land of Israel. And there's going to be people doing nevuah. There's going to be people who are young, and it's the descendants of the people who this nevuah is going to, as well as like the people in that generation who would be the zekanim, which could be the people who are the leadership of the people who keep the Torah. Now, what's important here is the statements that we're talking about. We know that they're the future because of something that it mentions here, which we showed earlier, where it says, Now, this means in translation, and it will be afterwards, comma, I will spill out or pour out, and then that's when it continues. So we know that based on the wording here, that when it says, this is all like future tense. And later it says, in those days. So when the Torah and when the Tanakh, when the creator of all things is speaking to a Navi, often when this language is used, and even in some of the sections that I didn't show here in this presentation, there are other sections where it mentions like this great day of the creator, or like, in those days, and that we know is like terminology that's used in Hebrew and in the Tanakh to talk about like the days that are basically what's called in Hebrew Yomot Mashiach, the time when the land of Israel is restored and the people of Israel are restored in the land of Israel. So going a little bit further now, starting with chapter 4, verse 1, now we can get into the, I guess, the real meat of what this person was asking me about. So if we can start here in the first line, what we see is the following. It says, Ki hine b'yamim ho'ema uva'et hahi asher oshiv et shuvuth Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So when we translate that, what we essentially get from it is that when it says is because, and it's like here with us, again, you can sometimes kind of choose these like little qualifiers that you want in those days and at that time. Now again, this is important because we saw earlier where it uses the statement Yomim ho'emo, and that's meaning in those days. But this one it says Ki hine b'yomim ho'emo uva'et hahi. So essentially we know that this is talking about like at a certain, in those days and in that time, meaning that this is talking about the future. Now going a little bit further, what it says is the following. Asher oshiv et shavuth Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So essentially it's talking about the exiles who are basically brought back, to Yerushalayim, that the creator of all things will return them, Oshiv. So there's also some text that says Oshiv or Oshuv, but that it will be something in the future where the creator will return or cause return to the people. And that, of course, is expressed in the little blue section. So essentially what is important, especially when dealing with translations, is that if you look at the English that I presented here, I've put punctuation in all the places that what's called ta'amim in the Hebrew text shows up, meaning that in ancient times there was a system that was created to know exactly when this was read, how exactly like were the pauses, what were the stresses. And in ancient Hebrew, you could actually change the meaning of a text by not having the right ta'am in the right place, meaning the right pause or the right stress in the right place. So for example, if I were to read this with the right stresses and pauses, it would go something like this. Ki hine b'yamim ho'emo uva'et hahi asher oshiv et shuvuth Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. So for example, there are certain notes that you may have heard me kind of go up and down with on it. And without having those there, that basically means that you've changed the text and you can change the meaning by it. So it's important where you see every place where you see a comma or a semicolon, that essentially that's important and that is something that has to be there, for example. So again, just analyzing this part of it, we notice that the statement Vayomim ho'emo in those days, and we notice that also it mentions here Uva'et hahi, which means in that time. Now in this section here, dealing with Yoel chapter 4 verse 2, I think it's very important to nail something down that's very important, which I think I may have not really fully fleshed out or even like really said in the best way possible. So what it mentions here is Kibatzti et kol ha'gzoyim v'horadetim el emek Yehoshaphat v'nishpatti imam shom al ami v'nachalothi Yisrael asher pizuru v'gzoyim v'et artzi cheligu. Now, what's important here is that when translated, what this basically means is, and this is talking about the Creator doing this, and it says, well, we'll gather them, the nations, meaning to, and bring them down to Emek Yehoshaphat. And Yehoshaphat, of course, was a king of ancient Israel. At one point, he was the king of Yehudah, the section of Israel known as Judah or Yehudah. And essentially, what's interesting is there's a lot of commentators that mention that his name being mentioned in this area is very important because his name basically means it's like the judgment of the Creator. So Yehoshaphat being mentioned here is like the judgment of the Creator. So the Creator's, of course, the one talking here because he was telling this information to the Navi. Now, what's interesting, he mentions here, "V'nishpatati imam sham al ami v'nachaloti Yisrael asher pizuru v'joyim ad artzi ha'iligu." So what he's saying is, "V'nishpatati imam." So essentially, he will contend with the nations, meaning that he will contend with them. He will enter into judgment with them, according to some sources. For the things that was done, as it's mentioned a little bit later, about spreading, about basically taking the people of Israel out of the land of Israel and, basically sending them away or exiling them into different lands and dividing them. So that is mentioned here as something that the Creator will bring the nations into judgment for, and he will enter into judgments for. And this is talking about future events, and it's using a wordplay of the judgment, as I mentioned before, with the name of Yehoshaphat to be, the way of saying that the Creator of all things will judge. And when it says "Nishpatati imam," which is mentioned here, imam, that is basically saying that the Creator himself will be the one to bring, to enter into judgment for these actions. So for example, essentially, like I said before, it's one of these situations where the Creator is talking about something that will happen in the future, and it was something that he will contend with the nations on because of the fact that the exile took place. Now, looking at that, and again, looking at the fact that it says there's nishpatati imam, that the Creator will enter in judgments about it. Let's think and look about, and see what the King James Version says. So switching to the English King James Version, and please excuse how I read this because I do not read King James English. This is the 1611 King James Version of the Christian Bible. And essentially, this is also a text from what I understand a lot of Hebrew Israelites use. I mean, I had some Israelites once tell me that King James was a Hebrew Israelite. He was, a black Israelite or something like that. So again, I don't know. That's between them and, their historians. But essentially what it says here, starting at the very top from chapter 3, it says, "Oh, behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring against the captitu of Judah and Jerusalem." And then it goes into 2 and says, "I will also gather all the nations and bring them," I can't understand what that word is, "bring them home, and the valley of Yehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have frattered among the nations and parted my land." Now, here is where the interesting part comes in. Notice that in this text it says that, "and I will plead with them for my people." It doesn't say I will contend with them or judge and enter into judgment with them about what they did. It says I will plead with them. Now this is interesting because you think about it. Why would the Creator of all things need to plead with the nations that are being discussed here? What would be the point of that? And that's where I find that this particular translation of the King James is very interesting. And, again, it doesn't matter to me what they do. I don't have a reason to really read this outside of this video that this person asked me about. But it is interesting that this King James Version uses a term that's completely different. It doesn't seem to understand that the statement "nishpatati imam" doesn't mean a pleading. It means that essentially, it's entering into judgment, with them. So that I found kind of interesting and strange. And, you could go through translation any day and find problems with it. And I haven't even gone into looking into the punctuation, which is something that I would even have the time including. Essentially what I'm trying to explain to this person, and I'm going to be using this video to show them, is that a Torath Mosheh Jew has no reason to use or rely on a translation. And a Torath Mosheh Jew has no reason whatsoever. I mean, definitely has no reason to use a King James version of the Bible. As a translation, it isn't something that we Jews hold by, and in fact, it includes the New Testament. So that's not something a Jew who holds by Torath Mosheh would even consider taking into account. So it's like saying if someone were to put it on the table and I didn't have a Hebrew text on me, I would just go to the internet and look up a Hebrew text and use that. But I would never make a decision based on an English text. I would never make a decision, especially on a King James version. So again, as I was trying to explain to this person and other Hebrew Israelites who I've come into contact with, is that Hebrew Israelites have a different culture, a different language, and a different group of text. And the King James version seems to be one used by a number of them. So as far as I say, it's okay. If that's what they use, that's what they use. But that's not a valid text when it comes to Torath Mosheh. So again, the point of this video was to show that a Torath Mosheh Jew would take the text in Hebrew text and go by that, and not use a King James version because it's just not a valid text for us. So I hope that helps. Thank you again for listening, and take care, everyone. And this is the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and living in Israel and Jerusalem, and I hope everyone around the world who's hearing this is doing well. Take care.